I'm David Peckman, Gallery Director, and with my fellow director, Karen Marks, and on behalf of Howard Greenberg, who could not be with us this evening, we welcome you to this In Conversation with Anthony Mason and Don McCullin. We're very pleased to have Anthony join us this evening as Don's partner in conversation. Anthony is a co-host of CBS This Morning, one of the most experienced and versatile correspondents in television news. During his over 3-decade tenure with CBS, Anthony has reported on national and international events from more than 40 different countries, including assignments in London, Germany, Hungary, and Russia. He's been recognized with many awards and has deep and broad international experience, which gives him special insight to Don's experiences as well. Don McCullin should need no introduction. His 6 decades of work as a photojournalist and a photographer should speak for themselves. His pictures do speak for themselves. For the voices of the displaced, of those who suffered, and of the places of solitude Don sought out to find tranquility. I'm deeply honored to call Don a friend for over a decade, and it's our great privilege to have these two eminent men in our company this evening. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for wading through the rain outside. You could have gone for a walk in the park, but I think this is a little better. Don and I had a long conversation earlier this morning for a piece we're doing for CBS This Morning, and I think we had 6 or 7 cameras in here and so many lights, and Don looked at me with a little bit of disdain, I think, for doing my job when you can do it with one little camera.
Yeah, I don't do it as well now because I'm getting old.
You don't look old, sir.
No, you don't know what goes on in this head of mine at 8. Anyway, I'm very pleased tonight because there are working colleagues here who've actually been with me in areas of conflict. Yeah. So whatever we talk about, I should be on my guard against them.
All right.
Okay.
Can we talk first about what it was like to have an exhibition at the Tate?
Yes, I know. Having an exhibition, and my friend here, Tim Jeffries, was behind it in a very big way. But having an exhibition in an art gallery, it does bring certain criticisms. You know, people saying, you know, why are you in an art gallery? You know, when you say you're not an artist, which I'm not really. Yeah. I'm a photographer. I've always fought against this title, which I don't need. So when you go into an art gallery, people criticize you, but I say, you know, I don't want my photographs hanging around in my house in yellow boxes when they were taken in the first place as a form of propaganda against war and violence and tragedies. I want to see, so I'll put my work anywhere. I would prefer to have my photographs in a huge railway station where thousands of people are crisscrossing, going home and coming into London to work. That would be the best place you could display your work.
It's an interesting idea because I think you said you want your photographs to hit people like an oncoming train.
I don't see any point in me going to a war and indulging myself in just taking photographs and composing them and making them all look rather comfortable. I go to war to show, it's a horrible thing. War. It's often perpetrated against people who've played no part in making it happen in the first place. Yeah. And you know, there are always women and children who are the last to be told that they're going to get zapped. And so, you know, the soldiers have always got their backup, and if they get injured, they get dealt with. But all the people I photographed in wars have always been the women and children. And it's so ghastly to see, you know, to punish those people for something they've never been responsible for anything other than trying to live their lives.
You don't like being called a war photographer.
It's a very nasty, and again, it's another title I can do without. I'm just a photographer, and when somebody says, "Oh, you're the war photographer," it makes you sound like an executioner or somebody who works in an abattoir. Yeah. I am not a killer of human beings. I don't like killing animals and things like that. And so therefore, I try to play the role of the peacemaker. That's where I belong.
But you are drawn to it. You've gone back to it again and again.
That's been my failing in life, really, because, you know, I feel guilty that that because I kept going back and back, and I thought there's something wrong with me, really. I mean, if I was the ultimate great human being, I would have not have got on the airplane. That's incoming, by the way.
Yes.
I would not have got on the airplane in London Airport. I would have said to the editor, no, let somebody else go. I couldn't resist it.
Yeah.
Because, shamefully, there is an
Hang on. Switch with me for a second.
Sorry.
Take that one. Like this word. One. Okay.
Yeah, there is a definite adrenaline rush in war. It's exciting. You cannot really enjoy yourself at the expense of other people's lives and suffering.
Yeah.
And we did, I have to say. We occasionally did enjoy the fact that we didn't get killed and we got away with it.
Yeah.
And that's not right, really.
But where do you at root, where do you think your fascination with that comes from? What is it that drives you to want to keep going, has driven you to keep going back?
Well, can I say that when I was 5 years of age, I lived in London, which was heavily bombed. So I've actually, as a child, experienced the fear of bombing. And then later on in the years, I was in Syria a couple of years ago when the Russian MiGs were bombing, and even the hardened frontline rebel fighters, you could see it in their eyes when they heard the jet coming. Mm-hmm. You could see the fear and anticipation. You could see the fear. As soon as they heard that screaming jet, you know, these men who were quite macho suddenly kind of started getting concerned. Mm-hmm. It's a fearful thing to be bombed, and it's 1,000,000 times more fearful when you're 5 years of age.
Yeah.
I've seen stuff on the television lately of children crying, and I feel utterly ashamed of the way things have turned out in the world. Everything I've done for the last 50-odd years hasn't changed one iota the state of the world as we live in now.
You took up photography kind of as an escape, didn't you?
Escape from my ignorant background, and it came as an accident to me, photography. And I came at the right time because in the late 50s in England, photography wasn't highly regarded. The people who worked in England in photography were the people who worked in the daily newspapers in Fleet Street, and they were not respected. The journalists always used to say to people, "Oh, by the way, have you met my photographer?" As if you were some shoe cleaner, some boot cleaner, you know. Yes. And I resented that. Yeah. And I thought, I'm not your photographer. I belong to myself.
Yeah. But you were headed for art school.
I worked on a train when I was 15 years of age. My father died, so I got a job on a steam train.
But were you not in art school before that?
I went to a junior art school, which was of no consequence. And then when I worked on the train, I enrolled in life drawing classes in St. Martin's School in London. Yeah. And I was fearful that I was going to go into a room and see a naked woman.
You were fearful?
Pardon?
You were fearful?
Well, as you get older, you would welcome such an experience. But I was fearful of going in this room at St. Martin's Art School in London, which is very distinguished. And there was a man standing there with a kind of pouch arrangement in front of him.
Yes.
So I was the whole thing didn't gel, really. And I've started it again recently, and I'm absolutely the lousiest artist in the world.
So you made the right decision, you think?
Well, I try to get it out of my system. But photography, I made a lot of mistakes in my young photographic life, but I managed to hide them. Mm-hmm. Not everybody can do that. But then what I did, I kind of beat myself up a lot about photography. I would spend hours and hours in the darkroom, starting at 6:30 in the morning. That's the best time to go in the darkroom when you've had a good night's sleep. Yeah. And make prints. And I wanted to be more than a photographer. I wanted to be a really good printmaker.
Mm-hmm. Why?
Because I think the print is the icing on the cake. I mean, if you have a great image, when I was in Vietnam and I saw the great images of the war, mm-hmm. they were made for Associated Press, and they were very small, very badly printed. But once they got in the newspaper, they were very, very powerful and important. The tragedy was the men who took those pictures in Vietnam were shabbily paid. They were given $25 mm-hmm. to go to the front, and sometimes they got killed or they lost an arm, you know. But $25 is not worth an arm or a leg or a life. Mm-hmm. So these guys in Vietnam who worked for Associated Press were treated very badly, really.
So you started taking pictures in the military, right?
Well, I was in the Royal Air Force, but I didn't take pictures. I was locked into a cabin for several hours a day printing aerial reconnaissance maps of the war in Africa, the Mau Mau War. So I've had a huge association with chemistry, which is like smoking 3 or 4 packs of cigarettes a day. I'm amazed I'm still here, really.
Yes. But that's when was that when you got your first camera?
I bought a camera. I paid £30, which is roughly $30 by today's money. And a pilot flew from Nairobi to Aden, where there's another war going on, by the way. And he brought the camera back. There was no duty to pay. And I had the camera, but I never used it. So I took it back to England after I was demobilized from the Air Force. And I pawned it for £5.
For
Pawned it, pawn shop, yeah.
Yeah. So how did you start taking pictures?
Because I wasn't in the atmosphere as I was in the Royal Air Force with people who did photography. I went back to the kind of the area I grew up in, North London.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't conducive to be talented where I came from unless you could fight.
Mm-hmm.
That was the only respect you got from your peers. Mm-hmm. So, you know, having a camera would have made me look like some kind of weakling or somebody who had a flair for something. They wouldn't have liked that.
But you had, what do I hear? You had some friends who you were hanging out with who ended up asking you to take their picture.
Well, one day they said, you know, you've got that camera. My mother got the camera back from the pawn shop. She went down with the ticket and paid the money, got it back. Mm-hmm. And I took a picture of these boys who were later involved in a gang war because England in the 50s was very tribal. Mm-hmm. It's all come back.
Yeah.
You've read the news lately about the terrible killings almost on a daily basis in England. It's all to do with tribalism, music and rap, whatever they call that music, you know. So all those years ago, everything I saw then has now repeated itself. As in the case of wars, they repeat themselves on a yearly basis.
Yeah. But they asked you to get your camera.
I took one picture of the boys in a derelict building. Yeah. I had no exposure meter. I had one roll of film. It was called FP3 in those days, made by Ilford. The exposure was 125th at f11. Mm-hmm. And that was...
Why do you still remember this?
Because it was the foundation of this extraordinary life that was given to me by whom I don't know. But I must have been chosen from you know, to have this life. I was given this extraordinary life on a plate. Having said that, of course, it didn't come cheaply, you know.
But that photograph opened the door for you.
Yeah, I took it to the Observer newspaper, and the editor, in a kind of quizzical way, looked at me and said, "Did you really take this picture?" And I said, "Yeah, sure I did." And he said, "Would you do more?" And I did some more, and I was actually arrested one night by the police because they were always abusing us where I lived, the police. Mm-hmm. I came out of this old cafe, and I'd photographed the boys inside the cafe, and I came out, there was a police car, the policeman said, "Get in," and I said, "No," because if you got in a police car where I lived as a boy, you got a good hiding. Mm-hmm. They had any excuse to hit you, and I said, "No, I'm not getting in." They said, "Get in this car." And so I was bundled into the car. They made me go home to where I lived, and they made me go into the house and find the receipt for this camera. Because I'm a bit of a collectomania, I've always kept tickets and bus tickets and receipts and train tickets. And I found and I went back and they said, "Mr. McCullum, may we take you back to where we picked you up?" And I can't tell you what I said to them. and you know, to this day, I've never had a healthy respect for the police. Mm-hmm. I've never liked them. Mm-hmm. It's silly to say a thing like this, but you know, we trust those people to look after us. Yeah. And they was always smacking us around in our youth, and I don't like them.
To what degree do you think that's influenced your photography?
Oh, Alfred Stieglitz, Edward Steichen.
But no, you're veering off on something. To what degree has your background influenced your photography?
My background.
My
background, because I grew up in a very poor district, I made it easy for me when I walked into the houses of people who were suffering extreme poverty. Mm-hmm. I wasn't uncomfortable. I wasn't an intellectual ex-university graduate, so I didn't feel uncomfortable in those houses. I can tell you now, I knew the smell of poverty, and I know those houses and the smell of those bedrooms. I slept in such rooms myself as a child.
Mm-hmm.
So I was the very best emissary to go and record those people's lives for what they were worth, and they weren't worth very much, I can tell you.
Where did your eye come from?
Sorry?
Where did your eye come from?
My eye.
Yeah, how you see.
It's an interesting question, that, because when I worked on the railway,
Mm-hmm.
I spent a year working on steam train that went to every part of England, oh, the west part of England anyway. And I was always looking out of the railway. I had a little window where I sometimes used to throw the plates out when I got kind of mischievous. I would watch these plates going down the great viaducts. And I watched the satanic cities of England that hadn't been cleaned up. And I went right through the backbone of England, where the people who did all the labor and made England great in the Industrial Revolution. And I have a very curious, romantic imagination. I think a lot of young boys or girls do, you know. I had a mind that used to want to wander and imagine. And I did these amazing journeys. And I remember once I used to get to the other end of the journey, and there was a boy who used to watch the trains at the other end with a big brush.
Mm-hmm.
And he said to me, "Would you like to go and see some naked ladies?" And I said, "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, there's a theatre." This was in Liverpool, which is an amazing city. Those cities, by the way, were incredible cities. They had incredible people. They were the north of England, and there was always a great divide. And to go back to my story, he took me to a music hall. It's quite a poor part of Liverpool. And they used to recreate some of Rubens, the great painter's, tableaus. And I was very curious, and I sat in this cinema, and then the curtain opened, and there was a whole load of ladies standing, only naked from the waist upwards. But at the age of 15, I can tell you that was like liftoff, you know. I do have some humor in my makeup, by the way. I'm not going to talk about misery and, you know. So from the age of 15,
Yeah.
I started to grow.
Mm-hmm.
I started to hate the neighborhood where I came from.
Mm-hmm.
I had a slightly inferiority complex on my shoulder, which I carried around far too long. It was the heaviest yoke you could carry on your shoulders,
Mm-hmm.
the class structure in England. So I was fighting all these things. And when I discovered photography, who I thought, by the way, discovered me, I started on an incredible journey.
Mm-hmm.
A journey that was to over-reward me, over-pain me. And even to this day, I'm still uncertain, even though I think I know how to print pictures and take pictures. There's still an uncertain side to me that makes me feel insecure sometimes.
But that's probably what makes you keep wanting to do it.
Well, I have a theory in life, is you should never meet your heroes, and you must never retire in life. You must always work, and your horizon must be endless.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my philosophy. I must always keep walking towards and learning and discovering.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what photography offers you. It's there for the taking.
Yeah.
Having said that, you do not own photography. You do not have the right to photograph injured, dying people in wars. And you're going to say to me, well, why did you do it?
Yeah.
Would you say it?
Why did you do it?
Because I was ambitious. And as a young man, your ambition can override principles.
Yeah.
It can carry you sometimes in the wrong direction, and you suddenly realize, my God, do I have the right to do this? Do I have the right to photograph dying children who drop dead in front of you? I've seen children dropping dead in the Biafran War, and I think, my God, you know, I've got children of my own. You know, why am I here? You know, so there are the moral principles of what we do and what I did are always open to question.
What you said you had ambition. What was that ambition?
I wanted to make my father's name. Means that my father died when I was 13, and it was the most painful experience. And you know, I wanted the McCullum name to be remembered while I'm on this short journey. And my father's journey was very short. He was 40 when he died.
Yeah.
And you know, I have his name, and I want his name to mean something.
So when you saw your name in the Observer,
When I saw my name under the Observer on the Sunday morning, It wasn't a newspaper we ever had in our house. It was too intellectual. It was too kind of left. It was all kinds of lovely. It was a great newspaper, The Observer. And when I saw my name under it, I thought, I can't believe this. And by the way, they gave me £50. It was a king's ransom to a man like me. And we had no telephone, naturally, in my house. And the place I worked in Mayfair, I worked in a small studio in Mayfair. The next morning, they tracked my place of work down. I was offered every job in England. I was offered a job in television. It was so embarrassing because I wasn't a photographer. I had to pirouette very quickly and start thinking, what the hell is this? And how am I going to take this on board? And I simply bought magazines, books, and I started finding my way on a wonderful journey.
You offered to go to Berlin in 1961.
I was in Paris, and the strange thing is, in this building, in that office in the corner, I saw something today which made me go to Berlin. It was a picture of an East German soldier in his full battle dress and his Kalashnikov, jumping over a barbed wire, which was only the thing that separated from East from West in 1961. And I was in Paris with my young wife, and I said, when we go back to England, would you mind if I went to Berlin? So I booked myself a ticket. And then I arrived in Berlin almost penniless. But I went to the Observer and said, I'm going to Berlin. And they said, well, we're not interested. And I went, and I had no backing. And I found my way down to Checkpoint Charlie, and it looked like the beginning of the Third World War. The Russians were there with their armor. The Americans were here. There were men in old bombed-out buildings, American soldiers. It looked like Berlin just after the war. And I was wandering around in a slightly naive way, taking pictures, and I tried to photograph over the wall itself was only about 5 or 6 feet high in the beginning. They made it very quickly with rough blocks. And as I leaned over the wall, an East German soldier came with a club to beat me. And I was looking at these soldiers, and they were dressed, the East Germans, they were dressed just like Nazi soldiers, with the same jackboots and the same balloon trousers and same hats. And I thought to myself, this is incredible. I'm recording history. And that was been possibly the most rewarding part of my life as a photographer. Every time I pushed that camera button down, I was recording history. And, you know, I wasn't a historian. I was so far removed from an academic world and mind, you know. I was going through all these events in a very naive way. And I thought, this is really exciting and really enjoyable until I started seeing the bodies.
Some of the most powerful images you've taken are the images along the back wall there, some of them of Hue, in '67, I think it was, right?
I went to the '67 war, and I was the only pressman in the Battle of Jerusalem. And I burst through a thing called the Lion's Gate with the Israeli army, and they immediately took some casualties, and then it all seemed to end. And I sat down, and I was dehydrated. It was the adrenaline and the emotional. And a man came to me and said, what the hell are you sitting there for? History is being made. And I thought, what's he talking about? And he said, you get down to the wall. So I found myself going through the labyrinth of old buildings, which has been pulled down today. And I saw a whole lot of men banging their heads against the wall. And of course, it was the most auspicious time in the life of the history of Israel. After 2,000 years, they were actually celebrating, you know, their prayers at the wall. And I thought, oh, I might as well take a few shots of this. I didn't realize how important it was. You know, it's taken me a long time to get wised up. And, you know, I'm quite a wild animal now. I read a lot of newspapers. I knew the events are coming. But in the beginning, in the early days, I was completely naive. I should never have been able to arrive the way I did.
How many times did you go to Vietnam?
Not many times. I went 2 or 3 times a year for several years. And in the beginning, I didn't do very well until I went during the Tet Offensive. I didn't take the best pictures in Vietnam. Ed Adams took one of the great iconic images. A man called Oot took the running girl down the road, which everybody in England thinks I took. So I didn't take the great iconic pictures in Vietnam, but the thing about war is that people don't understand that when battles start, they don't always last very long. They stop and start, stop and start. But in the Battle of Hue, in the citadel, the ancient city, it went on for nearly 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And then I became like an animal, really. I realized I didn't belong to the U.S. Marines. You do not belong to them as a brethren. You know, they saw you as some weirdo that had cameras and your hair was too long and they didn't like the look of you. And then one day I photographed a wounded soldier and I said to them, bring him to me, because there was a very dangerous alleyway where the snipers, I said, bring him to me.
Yeah.
And they ran and they fell with him. And he had a bullet that had gone into his groin and come out of his backside. And the man was in such agony, but I photographed him with his arms spread out like Jesus Christ. And he fell, and I felt so bad. And I picked him up and put him on my shoulders and carried him away from the battle.
Mm-hmm.
And he sent me a letter last year saying that he went to Guam to recuperate in the hospital. And he sent his mother a letter and said, this nice Englishman picked me up. And I was very strong when I was 31. I could pick this man up easily. And when you're wounded, the last thing you want in a war is to be wounded a second. All you want to do is get the hell out of it.
Yeah.
So I thought maybe that gesture, it was spontaneous. It wasn't conniving, thinking, oh, this is going to do me a favor with the others. I did it spontaneously out of guilt because he fell coming to me.
Yeah. The photograph on the back wall of the soldier with the vacant look, the 1,000-yard stare.
Strange enough, I don't like that picture because...
Why?
Well, it's like Eddie Adams said to me once about the shooting picture. He said, I hate that picture with another word in front of it.
Yeah.
He said, I hate that picture. He said, it's demonized my photography and it's eradicated everything I did that came before it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the danger when you've worked for many, many years and you take one picture that people think is, if I can use the word iconic, which is also dangerous to me.
Yeah.
Because iconic means the ultimate, composed, beautiful, whatever.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I feel every time I open my mouth, I have to be very guarded. Because if I say the wrong thing, I'm going to be brought down with criticism I can't answer back.
You feel that's too well known?
Yeah, I do, actually. And if I do an exhibition, they say, oh, let's make a poster out of this, and I say, no, let's not do it. You know, I have 60,000 negatives in my house. That's not many.
But I'm interested in that for one particular reason, because you've talked about how difficult, I mean, as someone who prints his own pictures, you've talked about how difficult it was to print that photograph.
Yes, because it might sound rather boring, but when you're in the darkroom, you have technical problems, you know, like for instance in the photograph, if you see the real negative, the helmet's almost white because the light is coming down. And in doing so, the light was trying to obscure his eyes. I think I said to you earlier this morning, I'm seeing it from here, this distance. You know, that man could have been wearing a crown of thorns.
Yeah.
I feel there's a similarity. There's something very religious about his suffering, as if it's Jesus Christ. I mean, I'm really taking liberties here, thinking that I'm good enough to make a picture of someone who looks like Jesus Christ. But, you know, if I don't have sensitivity and emotional connection, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to make these kind of pictures.
Mm-hmm.
I want my pictures to haunt you. And the truth...
Because they haunt you?
Pardon?
Because they haunt you?
They're a bloody nuisance. I don't sleep very easy at night, you know.
Yeah.
And I'm not looking for any understanding here. I knew you can't go and photograph other people's suffering and think you know, it's not a free ride. There's a price to pay. But what I'm saying is that I feel all the voice of those people will come to you from their eyes. When you look at their eyes, you can feel their suffering. This might sound very strange, but if I didn't feel the way I am, I think a lot of my pictures wouldn't have any voice. They wouldn't have any meaning.
Yeah.
You know.
You took 5 images of that soldier.
I took 5 images. That man never blinked an eye. I mean, they're all identical, the pictures. So if the negative gets damaged one of these days, I can go down to the next one. But while we're talking about him, the picture next to it is probably one of the most disturbing pictures I've ever taken.
Yes.
Because I arrived in the Congo
in
1964. I was still working with the Observer newspaper, and Mobutu, the ruler of the Congo, was one of the most evil, terrible people.
Yeah.
Put the place called Stanleyville, where I took that photograph, 1,000 kilometers away from the capital, out of bounds to journalist.
Yeah.
And I disguised myself as a mercenary with the aid of a mercenary who I met in Leopoldville.
Mm-hmm.
And I flew 1,000 miles on a C-130 airplane, and I had to go down in the early morning and line up with the mercenaries, and then a man with a clipboard, who was a CIA man, went down the line saying, "What's your name, what's your name, what's your name?" And he came to me and he said, "What's your name?" And my legs were like jelly, because I was playing a role. I was an intruder. And I said, "McCullen." And he said, "You're not on the list." And he said, "How do you spell it?" And he said, "Get on." And I flew 1,000 kilometers in this C-130. And I arrived in the town of Stanleyville, which was famous from the Stanley, the great explorer.
Yeah.
And I could hear gunfire. And I had 20 rolls of film and two Nikon cameras and an exposure meter and a little bag. And I was dressed in this mercenary uniform. And a man came up to me and said, "Where's your rifle?" He said, "We want you on the other side. There's a big show going on over there."
Yeah.
I said, "I don't have a rifle." He said, "What the hell are you talking about? Don't have a rifle?" He said, "Who are you?" And then I said, "Well, I'm going to have to come clean. I'm from the Observer newspaper." And he said, "You're in dead trouble."
Yeah.
So they kept me overnight. But while this was going on, they were tormenting these boys in that picture.
Yeah.
And they were dragging them behind trucks on wires, skinning them alive,
Yeah.
and then shooting them in the back of the head.
When you were in the middle of something like that, what are you thinking?
If you want the honest truth, shall I tell you what I was thinking? I was thinking, I've got to get pictures of this. That's the first thing I'm thinking. I've got to get pictures. I've risked my life coming all this way.
Yeah.
I cannot stand here and not record this outrageous atrocity.
Yeah.
The screams are terrible.
Yeah.
You had to deafen yourself to the screams and the pleading and the begging. These boys are being dragged.
How do you deafen yourself?
Pardon?
How do you deafen yourself?
You can't. You can't. You're crying inside. You're trying to. You're in denial, and yet at the same time you have this professional longing to do your work, and you're wrestling inside with all kinds of decisions that are coming at you like kind of satellites. They're coming at you, and you have to say, "I want to do this. I've got to do this," and then I did take a few pictures. And one of the other guys came along, and the officer, and confiscated one of my rolls of film, which is the worst thing every photographer dreads.
Yeah.
Have you ever had lost film? It's the worst thing that can happen to you.
It's
I
heartbreaking.
managed to salvage a roll and a half
Yeah.
to get those pictures of those. Now you see, standing in front of those those Congolese gendarmerie who were doing the killing, I couldn't intervene. You know, I've stood in front.
Do you feel helpless at a moment like that, or what do you feel?
There's nothing else you can feel. I have
Yeah.
to tell you. I was with a friend of mine once, and we stood in the jungle in Biafra, and I heard a man went to the commander and said, "What should we do with the prisoners?" He said, "Kill them." And I was with a French photographer, very famous, called Gilles Caron, and he was later murdered himself in the same way in Cambodia.
Yeah.
So we stood there and we were dumbfounded. And then the man went back to the commander and said, "Sir, I'm sorry to ask you, but what shall we do?" He said, "I told you, kill them." And they started shooting the prisoners, who were shaking and crying and looking at us. And I thought, what the hell has this got to do with photography? Why am I here? You know, and you know, the shame. You can be steeped up to your neck in shame, and you think, this is killing my. There's a selfishness that you're fighting. You're asking all these questions, but the ugly truth of it is you're coming down and you're thinking about yourself. You can't stop these things.
We were talking this morning about, I think when we were talking about when you were in Vietnam, and particularly in the Tet Offensive, there was the worst fighting of the war was occurring in that, and you were in some very, I mean, the unit you were with in Hue lost something like 2/3 of the men.
Yes, the company.
Yeah. When you're in the middle of fighting like that, I know some of the cameramen that I've worked with, when they put their eye behind the viewfinder, the world around them effectively disappears.
Yeah.
What happens with you?
Well, you've got to bear in mind you're wrestling with fear. You know, and fear is not a good companion when you're shaking and you're trying to not get camera shake as well. You're there, and one day I was flying, and I was literally almost avoiding swallowing the dirt, and I was watching two men get killed by a sniper. Another man got hit in the leg, and his leg was burst wide open. The man who got killed, he's in one of my photographs. He was the corpsman, and when he got killed, the other men were crying.
Yeah.
They loved this man. This man was saving lives, and he got killed. And that day, I will never forget it. I felt so lonely because I didn't belong to this man. And he got, men were crying over this other man. And I thought to myself, there are so many things you have to learn and understand about humanity. And I didn't come from a background of knowledge, academia, I didn't have a family that were guiding me, and I grew up with violence anyway. I thought that was the norm. And then suddenly you're a man at 31 years of age, and then you're witnessing so many things you're meant to understand, but you don't.
Yeah. When your eye goes into the viewfinder in the middle of a battle.
Well, the viewfinder doesn't give you any comfort. It's there, and I lost 2 rolls of film that day. They fell out of my bulletproof jacket. And by the way, I was wearing clothes that probably belonged to dead men. I went to the first field area. I didn't have a helmet. I didn't have a bulletproof jacket for the first few days. And someone said, go down to the field hospital and get yourself some proper gear, And then after a while, I remember one day I slept under a table because I was afraid of mortar bomb coming and blowing my face off. And then one day, I always went out of this little shack that way. And the other day, another day, I thought, I'll go the other way this day. And behind where I was sleeping was a dead North Vietnamese soldier. We were almost sleeping in a parallel place with just a kind of corrugated fence between us. And I saw him after that on a daily basis. His eyes were open, and they were full of rain. If I was a great writer, I could come in and write about war in another direction totally.
Yeah.
But it would not be about the glamour of war that Hollywood weaned me on as a child.
But what I want to get at here is when you're in a moment of combat where you are under enormous personal risk, you suggested this afternoon that is when your eye was in the viewfinder that all you worried about was the picture.
Yeah.
How does that happen?
Well, I'm not a trained medic. Even if I could pick somebody up and run away with him, that was my job.
Yeah. What I guess what I'm asking is, what happens to the fear? The fear. What happens to the fear?
My feelings.
What happens to the fear?
Oh, fear. I think I'm slightly deaf. Anyway, the fear is always there. Anyone who tells you he's not afraid in war is a liar.
Yeah.
The fear is there. Sometimes I would have a 2-yearly breakdown. I remember being in Cambodia one day, and I ran across the field. And in the early stages of the Cambodian War, the Cambodian army was still working on a Napoleonic dressage. They would have a boy with a flag. They would all be wearing slightly bright uniforms, which made a marvelous target. And I ran across the field against the advice of a Vietnamese officer who was waiting with a battalion. He sent them in as a feeler to see where the fire was coming from. And I ran across that field, and we didn't get very far at all, and the guys over with just got wiped out. I got down behind the radio operator, because that's the most solid piece of equipment to protect my head. And then I ran away, and I splashed through the paddy fields. I could really move when I was 31 years of age. And I lied down, and I was lying in the water, but I put my camera on the side. I don't know if it got hit with the AK bullet there or when I was running, I don't know. But it was the closest thing I came to being killed in a war. And if I had been killed, there's been 1,000 journalists killed in the last 50 years in wars, men and women, 1,000, possibly a lot more, particularly because of the Syrian war. Is a negative or a piece of film worth a human life? But I didn't stop to think about that, really. I still got that camera, and the extraordinary thing was the shutter still worked. And it still is covered in the mud of Cambodia, that terrible day of my life.
Yeah. Was that the day in 1970 when you were?
It was 1970. It was in a small village, yes. A small village. You were dealing with kind of mud farmers and people like that. One of the best portraits I ever took in Vietnam, it wasn't of a soldier. It was the hatred of a Vietnamese farmer's eyes looking at me as I passed through his village.
Yeah.
Some of his animals had died with an airstrike, and he thought I was an American. And this photograph says nothing but hatred
Yeah.
towards me.
There's a great quote on the wall in the other room that of yours. It says, "I wanted my images to contaminate your thoughts because they contaminate mine."
Well, when you think what you had to go through, I mean, there are people in this room I've worked with who've been in conflict.
Yeah.
They know what I'm talking about tonight.
Mhm.
But, I mean, when you go through all that, it would be a total futile waste of time if you brought these images back that didn't disturb the people in those newspapers, which you won't see today, by the way, in newspapers. Not in my country, anyway.
Yeah.
They've given up that duty. You know, when you talk about fake news, when you talk about fake news, that's all we seem to get in our newspapers now. We're not seeing any real news anymore. We're seeing frivolity and, you know, narcissism. So, you know, why is the people who own newspapers, why have they negated to give up their duty to give us real news? Because it's uncomfortable.
You've taken some color photographs, and I know you told me today that I think the Observer and the Times would ask you for color.
Yeah. Well, it was a color magazine I worked for, but I was defiant about that. I thought, in the end, they wound up putting my black and white pictures on color pages, and they look even stronger. They have a bluey black, threatening look about them. I have a lot of color pictures. I don't talk about them.
Why not?
Well, because they look like chocolate box. You know, they made the world look happy and joyful. And
Yeah.
It's not the world I live in. It's not true.
Mhm.
And I don't like color photography.
Mhm. Would you ever have a color exhibit? Would you ever have a color exhibit?
Not if I could help it. I have 20,000 color transparencies in my house.
You do?
Yeah, and they're all hidden away. Nobody sees them.
Yeah.
But I just think I am a black and white man. I drew my strength from a man called Eugene Smith,
Yeah.
who was a great photographer in the Pacific War.
Mhm.
And I did meet him one day. And he and I looked at each other as in a most alien way. You know, he was a great hero of mine. And we sat in a restaurant in Tokyo, and it was one of the most boring evenings I think he had in his life, actually.
You still print your own pictures.
I do. I don't get up so early anymore. I used to go in the darkroom about 6:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
When you've had a good night's sleep. You know, I know of people who go in the darkroom at night. I don't know how they do that, because you've used your energy of the day. So
Yeah.
why would you exercise something important at night when you're not 100% fit to do that?
Yeah.
I go in the early morning when I've had a good sleep, and you know, I'm ready for the darkroom. I'm terrified the night before I go in.
Are you? Why?
Well, I lie awake in bed and I think, am I going to put this on grade 2 paper or grade 3 paper? Am I going to use this developer? Am I going to do... And also loading film in the spiral is very tricky too.
Yeah.
And even when I'm loading film in the dark, I close my eyes. And sometimes I've become a bit peculiar in my old age, because I go around when I'm in the house alone, when my wife's not here, who's here now. When she's not there, I go around in the house and I try to make out I'm using Braille. I don't like to put the lights on. There's got to be some peculiar side to people like me.
Decided why you're doing that.
Sorry?
You haven't decided why you're doing that.
It's a kind of temptation, really.
Yeah.
It's something that's tempting me. It sounds odd, doesn't it, really? But I know none of us are totally sane, are we?
I hope not.
So.
But why have you always insisted on printing your own pictures?
Because no man can interpret what I've seen with my eyes. No man can interpret the emotion I suffered that day when I photographed a man walking towards me. I found a woman once in India carrying a dead child, and they couldn't get the child from her. It was in a refugee camp on the border during the Bangladesh war. And this woman, it wasn't her child even. She was too old to have a child. She wasn't even the grandmother. She found this dead child because there were loads of them lying around. And she picked it up, and she spent the whole day walking around this camp. And I photographed the people, the Red Cross people, persuading her to hand over this child. And I think she was slightly insane, really. It wasn't about compassion. You're going to meet all kinds of human suffering in wars, and it's not always easy to justify and analyze why these individuals are acting the way they are. It's very complicated.
When we were looking at your books earlier today, the one that you chose to pull out and show me was the one of landscapes.
Yes, because I think somebody said to me once, have you ever been to a shrink? And I said if I did, I'd make him pay me for the experience. Because frankly, you know, there have been moments in my life that have been dark, and you know, I've never sought help from anybody, because post-traumatic stress seemed to have come after the Vietnam Wars and the Falklands Wars and things like that. And you know, I'm not the only photographer who's been to war. You know, I know a lot of photographers have been to war. We've all somehow managed to get through it. But I live in a part of England that's full of legend. The Arthurian legend is very close to where I live in Somerset. It's called the Vale of Avalon. It's so almost Hollywood, really. And it's where the Glastonbury tour is, where they think King Arthur's buried. Well, it's total nonsense, really. But the landscape there is flooded in the winter, and then you have flooded landscape, great rumbling wintry skies. I mean, I used to go down there and stand there. And when you're a photographer standing in the landscape, things happen. And one day I could hear a splashing in this river dike, and I saw an otter running towards me with an eel in its mouth. And it was like somebody had given me the winning lottery ticket. It was like you stand in the landscape and a fox will come by or a deer will come by. You know, it's not like the guy who works in the city in an office, or a man who drives a train or a bus, or you know, a taxi driver. This is an extraordinary privilege to have a life in photography. And that's why I chose the landscape, and the landscape has paid me back with releasing me from a lot of the memories of war.
Yeah. I think it was Le Carre who said that even your landscapes look like battlefields.
It's only because I print them excessively dark. They are dark, my landscapes, and I think really I can't stop printing dark.
Why is that?
I don't know. There's a very wonderful photographer I love very much. His name is Joseph Sudek, and he lost an arm in the Austro-Hungarian War, and he was a very short man. He wasn't the most attractive man in the world, but he had a heart that just bled the most beautiful imagery. And he started printing his pictures so black. In the end, they looked just like black squares of black. Yeah. And you, as a creative person, yeah, not an artist, I might say, you have no boundaries. I mean, anything you want to do, you must do it. Yeah. You must do what your heart and emotions tell you to do. Mm-hmm. And when I'm in the darkroom, the darkroom is a dark place, and it's a place of, it's a spooky, dark place that can bring back memory. I have a particular picture of a dying African albino boy, and I haven't printed it for about 30 years. Yeah. But when that boy comes in, the developer, he is screaming at me, yeah, and I'm talking to him, and you talk in the darkroom to yourself. It's not the first stage of madness, but it's an interaction that is emotionally being, yeah, put into your prints.
Yeah. So how do you?
I didn't feel that. You know, my prints, yeah, would be weak.
So how do you feel in the darkroom? When you're in the darkroom, how do you feel?
I feel free. I feel free to talk to myself. I feel free to swear, curse. I feel free to laugh, and when I see the print the way I want it to be, you know, I feel great. I feel really. And then when I come out of the darkroom, I'm afraid of the light, because yeah, I feel the darkroom it's been a kind of inner sanctuary where not many people would understand. To go is a special. Millions of people live on this world. They wouldn't even know what I'm talking about when I talk about the darkroom to start with. Yeah. The only thing about when you go to bed at night and you put the lights on, you go to sleep. Yeah. So,
is that the? I mean, satisfaction may not be the right word to use, but from your point of view, when that image reaches the point that you want it to be at, is that the purest moment of satisfaction professionally for you?
I'm afraid.
Of what?
The image. I'm afraid that it's not going to, you know, when you go into the darkroom, you take a piece of paper which costs you $30 now, because, yeah, you know, this wonderful chemistry doesn't come cheap. And when I throw a sheet of paper away, I feel absolutely ashamed to look in that bin.
Yeah.
I think you failed. You failed yourself, and
Yeah.
you know better than this. You can do better than this. So in a way, it's like could only describe it as a bit of self-flagellation, really, because you're pushing for the best, and you know your peers in the world of photography and the art, the dealers in the. And you said the word art there. Sorry. You know they're going to judge you on your ability to make the everlasting beautiful print. And I mustn't use the word beautiful, must I? Because okay in landscape, not good in war.
Mhm.
You can't talk about. Strange enough, there are moments of beauty in war. When I earlier told you about the soldiers crying, and the way medics tenderly, caress people who are in great pain, and you do see beauty in war. I know it sounds an awful thing to say, but the way I'm talking tonight, really, it might sound absurd, but it's a good way for me to let all this out and tell people, what it's like. I go there with a camera.
No.
That's the funny thing about it. I go there with a camera and I record these things. And when I get on the airplane and come home, I feel sad, I feel guilty because I survived. I worry about the exposures of my film. I never go to war and photograph without I jump up and take the exposure reading, which is asking for trouble. Yeah. But, and at the end of the day, it's been a fantastic journey. But it's been a hell of a bloody torment. I've been tormented from the moment I discovered photography. It's the worst possible mistress you can have in your life. It's a real trial.
You've been knighted.
Can we not talk about that? It's the rewards that worry me.
Why?
Because I shouldn't have been rewarded.
But what about that young man who wanted to see his father's name honored?
That's the trouble in England. Things are changing now, but when I was a boy in England, the suppression of class levels were terrible.
Yeah.
A man came up to me one day. I was photographing a Commonwealth Prime Minister's conference near Downing Street, and I jumped in front of all the other photographers, and this photographer came up to me and said, "Oi, you must never do that. You must know your place." And I said, "I don't have any place. I've always been defiant. I don't have a place in life. It's where I choose to be is my place." And I thought, you stupid old man, you've been working in Fleet Street all these years.
Yeah.
And you think it's, you must behave and stand as a group and behave yourself, I want to do something different. And then he said, "Oh, by the way, that stupid little camera you're using, which was a 35 millimeter, they were all using medium format cameras in those days, in the early 60s. He tried to bring me down because I was using a 35mm camera, which was the camera of the photojournalist.
Yeah.
It was the camera that was going to go much further than the 2 1/4 square negative. So, that's why I worked alone in my life. I didn't want to be arguing with fools.
But you also said to me, you found yourself, I think, at Prince Charles' birthday party?
Can you tell me where the back door is? What have I done wrong to deserve this question?
But you were looking at that in a somewhat ironic way.
Because my best friend was his brother-in-law.
Yeah.
Who died in this city a couple of years ago, fell over and cracked his head.
Yeah.
That's the only reason I went to that party. I think they felt sorry for me, really.
But how did you feel to be there?
I was curious. It's a curious thing to go from the bottom of the pile in England
Yeah.
to the top of the pile.
Yeah.
And
You're uncomfortable at the top of the pile?
No, I wasn't uncomfortable. I'm a curiosity seeker. That's what our profession is all about.
Yeah.
Once you enter media, you have to seek out every possible thing there is to offer in the challenges that you must challenge everything in your journey in media.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing that's forbidden for you. And you must never accept forbiddenness. You must always break through and do it, even if you get a kick in the teeth.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, no one's ever hit me. Only one person ever hit me outside of that statement. It was a woman in Beirut.
Yeah.
There was a colossal bomb that collapsed a block of flats, and I heard terrible screaming. And suddenly round the corner came a woman smacking her face, pulling her hair, beating her breast, and I quickly photographed this woman. It was the biggest mistake of my photographic life. And she came right towards me and started punching me with all the anger of her pain. I took the most amazing beating. I was surrounded by hundreds of people who were there because they were all. And a man came up with a pistol, and he was shaking, and he tried to take my camera away. And I wouldn't let him have it. And I don't know why he didn't pull the trigger. And I went back to the hotel. I was shaking, and I deserved this. And I was shaking. I went into the hotel, Commodore in Beirut, which was the press hotel. There was nobody there. I said, cup of coffee, please. I sat down, and a man came in, another guy, and he said, Don, you know that woman? I said, leave me alone. He said, no, I've got to tell you, she's just been killed. He said a bomb was going off and blown her down the road. And I thought, what a curious life.
Yeah.
What a curious day. I did a book once called The Uncertain Day. And that's what life is like in journalism, media, photography. You never know what that day, what harvest that day will bring upon you.
Well, with that, I think we should open this up to questions, folks. Anybody? Yes, sir.
Don, a few years ago when you did Desert Island Disc, you picked 7 remarkable songs. You picked the Puccini, you picked another opera, you picked Paul Robeson, Adagio for strings, No Tower. What part does music play in your life? Is it in home? Is it in the dark room? I was really impressed by what you picked.
Well, strange enough, there is a picture here of a boy who later became very famous. His name was Mark Bolan. T-Rex he was called. I hated him, actually. Because he was a cocky little boy who lived in North London. And his whole thing was dressing up in little modern suits and things. And when he became T-Rex, of course, he totally changed his persona. And he did an interview for the Times newspaper and said, Don McCullum took a terrible picture of me. That was the picture next door. But coming back to Robert's question, music also is a one-way traffic to the soul. I hate pop music. I live near one of the biggest pop festivals in the world in Glastonbury, and I hear it at night. My wife Catherine here likes the windows open at night, and I wanted to shut the windows to keep that noise out. I think the classical music is the foundation of my emotion. It's very moving. It ties in with a lot of the things I photograph, and the landscape. I can go to the landscape, and I actually whistle now and again, which annoys people when I'm walking behind them in the street. You know, people turn around and think some lunatic behind me. But I love music, and it's all in my mind. I know I would have rather been a musician than a photographer. I would have loved to play the piano. I would have seduced the world. Unfortunately, I didn't come from that background, and so music, without it, I couldn't live, really.
Anyone else?
Good, we can go home. Sorry.
What do you think is the ultimate goal for a journalist? Photojournalist.
Simply to tell the truth, show the truth. If you can show the truth, you've done your job. You know, if you can bring back, you know, many years ago, in the early days of my life, coming up against the journalists in Fleet Street, they weren't always honest. They would make up stories. I knew they would make up stories. And there's never been a reason to make a story up in a war. You're surrounded by stories. You're surrounded by, you know, imagery, and you're surrounded by things you can write about and see in a photograph. So ultimately, it's very simple. You go there, you find the truth, and you bring it back. And, you know, when you think that we are no less than carrier pigeons, we go there, we bring it back. And that's our duty, really. Nothing more, nothing less.
Yes, sir.
This gentleman has asked me about the composition in my pictures. I've always thought that if you're going to get people to stay looking at your work,